Well, welcome back to this thought for the day on Francis, and we continue in Franciscan spirituality. It's, as you can see, it's a deep and rich field, and I'm only really glimpsing or sort of skimming the surface. And obviously, like I said before, we're not going into much of the application of all this, and perhaps that's something we can do in future times. But it's the 20th of April. So welcome. Today, I'm going to start on sort of a bit of a trilogy. We like our Trinitarian theology in Franciscan spirituality, and we're going to talk about the vows of the Franciscans and how. And I'm going to take each one of them over the next 3 days because they're a bit too rich to just try and cram into one. And if you don't know what they are, I will say to you that they're poverty, chastity, or celibacy, but I prefer the word chastity because of other meanings that it entails, the fullness, and obedience. So when you see a Franciscan friar in his brown habit, or grey habit in some cases, with their rope around their waist, you'll notice that on the end of one of the strands there will be 3 knots. And those 3 knots remind them of those 3 vows that they take as their final vows into a Franciscan life, which is poverty, chastity or celibacy, and obedience. However, in Franciscan spirituality, we understand that those 3 vows are actually just sub vows, as it were. They're things that we attest to, which enable us to actually to fulfill the one true vow that all Christians have, and that is the vow to live a committed life to Christ. So those 3 individual vows that Franciscans make are an aid to live out that one vow that each of us at our baptism has made. So all Christians make that vow to have Christ as Lord, to live under the lordship of Christ and to follow his way. So that just puts it in perspective. So I'm going to take the first of those, which is the one most commonly associated with Franciscans, the vow of poverty. And it's worthwhile saying that poverty in and of itself was never a means to an end. Like, it's never the end in itself. That wasn't poverty wasn't there just to be poor. Again, the vow of poverty was to lead us deeper into our relationship with Christ and through Christ with each other. And so for Francis, the vow of poverty was crucial. Now, each of these 3 vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, are what Francis would call the evangelical counsels. And when we use the word, again, evangelical here, it means that they are directly derived from the Gospels, the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so we can quite clearly see in the Gospels the teaching of becoming poor, to identifying with the poor and the outcast. So for Francis, it wasn't, poverty wasn't about being poor for being poor's sake. It was about identification with those who are poor. And that's what he saw in the life of Christ. He took his inspiration from such passages as we mentioned yesterday, the encounter with the rich young man. If you want to be perfect, sell all you have and give it to the poor and follow me. And Francis took that literally. Now, what does that mean for us today is another matter. But the other thing is, to put it in a little bit of historical context, it's interesting that Francis was living in not dissimilar times to ourselves in the 13th century, where more and more wealth was being funneled into only fewer and fewer people. Now, we're not in the exact same circumstances as the 13th century, but history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly has echoes. We can see the echoes of history in our own times today. And so Francis's embracement of poverty was, could be seen as a rejection of the excesses of his day. It was a rejection of the capitalism of his father, who was a rich merchant and was a social climber. In his early days, we know Francis was totally bought into that and was intending to be a social climber too. But once he understood Christ and understood the Gospels and what Christ calls us to, he realized that actually that to follow that path is an anathema to the Gospels. You can't serve bread. You can't serve God and mammon, or wealth, as it says in the Bible. And it wasn't lost on Francis that Jesus actually talked more about what we do with our money and how we accumulate it, and such than any other topic in the Gospels. So this is a real key tenet. Now, for third order Franciscans such as myself, we're not asked to have a vow of poverty, but we are, because obviously that's not practical necessarily if you have a family and things like that. But we are asked to have a vow of simplicity, and it's more about our attitude to wealth and to material things, as is the vow of poverty, realizing, like Jesus often said as well, store up your treasures in heaven, not here on earth, that actually material goods actually get in the way and divide people. We live in an era of rampant corporate capitalism, and more we see that extraordinary amounts of wealth are held in just the hands of a few billionaires around the world. Now they try and appease themselves, as did people in Francis's day, by what they call philanthropic acts. But again, they control the means of that, and they use that philanthropic impulse to try and clean up their name as to how they got their wealth in the first place. And Francis saw that. Many of the great cathedrals and monasteries of his day, which the monasteries that were existing before at Francis's time, were in a state of decline and decay, and there was a lot of moral laxity in the monasteries of that day. Yes, the monks were not considered to have personal wealth, but the monasteries themselves were exceptionally wealthy, and many of the monks enjoyed a lifestyle that regular everyday people just couldn't even imagine enjoying. So Francis was an affront to that as well. So, like I said, many of the cathedrals and monasteries got wealthy through bequests from rich people trying to assuage some of their guilt and some of the violence they've committed in order to get that wealth. And we see echoes of that today. That people of extraordinary wealth and with billions of dollars and pounds in wealth, try to assuage some of that, the means by which they obtained that, by philanthropic acts. So the vow of poverty, I suppose, is one of those things which has huge resonances for us today, and is one of the key things that we can buy into. We can look into and see, well, how do we live out this Franciscan idea of challenging the corporate structures of this day? Brother Ramon, Raymond, who I get much of my inspiration from for these talks, posed a few questions in regards to how we work out the idea of poverty in our time and in our personal lives. And they're real dilemma questions, and there's no easy answers, and one person might lean towards one way or the other in answering these. But it does pose an issue that Francis and we now have to wrestle with today. In my personal life, am I expected to share all my money and goods that are superfluous to an extremely simple lifestyle is a question. So these are all questions. Wouldn't it mean that I would have no bank account, no pay insurance, have no mortgage, own no property? What about my family and the dependence of my spouse and children? Can I expect my dependents to go without basic comforts for the sake of my principles? And corporately, should my church own property and negotiate developments and investments? Can and should politics be pacifists? Should I not refuse to pay taxes, especially while Britain pours millions of pounds into the nuclear Trident submarine project? And if I refuse to be protected, do I thereby disallow national military defence and dispense with police force? How should we react to international aggression and national crime? See, these are some of the questions that may come out as and dilemmas that we wrestle with when we understand the vow of poverty and what it sometimes may well call us to. And people will land in different places on this. But at the heart of its call to poverty, Franciscan spirituality is really about identification with each other, knowing that actually the possession of things gets in the way of relationships. If you've got nothing materially to lose, then you don't mind if people come in and out your house because they've got nothing to take. We only lock our doors and set our alarms and put insurance on things if we've got stuff to lose. And it divides us. So we're basically locking people out in order to protect those things that we consider valuable materially in our lives. These are questions that are worth pondering in regards to Franciscan spirituality. And like I said, there are no easy answers. I know this is a slightly longer one than normal, but these three vows are key. And tomorrow I will have a look into the vow of chastity. Thank you.